Now I got, and there's a link description below for what I'm showing right now. Delta Point thread, Delta latest updates and discussion, and that is on heroscapers.com, and where you can get information on Delta Classic, Delta VC, and such. And I might pop that open so we can look at that while we're having this discussion. But I guess my first question for you, Chris, is okay. What is Delta Points? Because coming up on ScapeCon 2 a couple of years ago, and I found out about Delta Points. I'm like, okay, so it's a different variation of how points are totaled within the cards depending on what figure. Part of me thinking, okay, what's the purpose? So tell us how this started, Chris, and what is this about?
Yeah, so let's just go briefly through what it is, and then I can hop back in history and go through that. So what it is basically just new points for every unit, or most units. Some units still have the same points that they have originally, but just trying to repoint value all of the cards that are out there to achieve as many different units being viable competitively as possible. Like there's basically no formats where Grok Riders in classic pricing are good, right? So you have some formats where Grok Riders are actually playable and good. So a lot of things went down in points, a lot of things went up in points, some pretty drastically. Q9 took a little bit of a hit to his point stock, as you might expect, as an example there. And then there's two real variations on Delta. So there's Classic Delta and then VC Delta, which are mostly the same but have a few differences in them. So that's for units that either don't allow VC or do allow VC in them, because VC introduces some things like cross bonding. So for example, Guilty McCreech is more expensive in VC Delta because he bonds with the Dreadgulls than he is in Classic Delta. So there's a few differences with those. Most things are the same, but yeah, there's two different sets of pricing that exist for those two formats. And then the goal is just to allow more units to be viable, open up metas a lot, let people play units that they like and have a much more reasonable shot to win with them than they would at standard pricing for a lot of the stuff that's not A- or better. Which tends to be the cutoff. If you're doing like a Bring 1 for traditional pricing stuff for like what actually has a shot to win the event. But in terms of like the history behind it, we can jump back a bit in time. So this is from before I was around Heroscape, but from digging a little bit, I found at least one previous iteration of Delta before what exists currently, back from 2012, which also had a Classic and VC Delta that they called Delta and Delta Plus. It doesn't look like it survived very long, but it was, an attempt at the time to do basically what Delta is doing currently. So at least back that far, I was able to trace the idea of Delta Points. And then in terms of like the modern instantiation of Delta, so April 2021 for OHS season 41, that's online Heroscape season, so online play, in case for anyone who just plays live. I believe Doc did basically all the work himself, so kudos for this. But basically did like a total points revamp of everything with Delta Points for all of the units to do just a Delta Bring 1 for that OHS season. So that was a lot of work, and that basically brought Delta into the modern age. I actually ended up winning that event with Quahan, 5 Spiders, and Mara Warriors. Which
sounds familiar.
All of those things now cost way more than they did in that initial Delta update, so I managed to get them bumps, and somehow that was enough of a qualification, I think, to get me onto the Delta team eventually. But then shortly after that event, which had a lot of people enjoyed it, had fun, so we were trying to try to build on that and make Delta something more sustainable. So Doc ended up turning it sort of into like a 3-person voting panel, and brought me and Vegetarian 18 on, and so those are the 3 of us are still the current Delta committee. So if there's a point, if there's a question about do we want to change the points of something, the 3 of us vote. If 2 people vote in favor of something, that wins it, and that's pretty simple. But at the time, it was a little bit difficult for most people to interact with, because basically it was just this really complicated Google sheet that had all these point totals and was acting as sort of like a pseudo army builder. So like all the data was there, and we were trying to work pretty hard to get the data, as more and more accurate. But it was a little bit difficult to sort of open it up to the masses and like have someone go to a new tournament with delta points where it was just quite cumbersome for them to sort of hop in and understand all the point differences.
Right.
So then the sort of next step after that was for ScapeCon 1 as a bit of a last minute addition. Mike Oyeao and I were chatting, I think on one of the tales about on one of his podcasts, or Sabers. I think we were actually talking about it on that, with the idea of trying to get a Delta event into ScapeCon late. And so it ended up happening. I think that the Wednesday evening time slot before ScapeCon 1 started, there wasn't anything scheduled for that. And so we ended up throwing together a Delta event sort of last minute, just like 500 points, VC, Delta, bring one. And it got a lot of interest there, and people seemed to enjoy it. A couple people ran Grox, some people ran a lot of the units that are traditionally garbage, but were became viable in that. And so that was a lot of fun to see those units actually have like a shot to win an event and win games over traditionally good units. So that went very well. Just kept sort of catapulting it based on that. Delta's been around ScapeCon since then, for ScapeCon 2, 3, and 4 in a few weeks coming up now. And so, but we were still sort of at the issue of like, it's difficult to introduce this to new people and make it easier for them to build armies with the various point totals. And so the next step ends up being that I made a standalone web page that was very simple. That was a Delta builder. So at the time it was pretty similar to what you see on the .org builder now, except it was basically just for Delta.
Okay.
The only purpose was to have something that was easier for people to interface with. See what their army looks like, plug in a bunch of figures, see what the total comes to it with Delta pricing, scroll through it and see the Delta pricing. And then when Heroscape.org became a real thing a little bit later, would be in like, I don't know, dates are hard. It ended up getting migrated over to the main builder on .org, off of the temp site that it was on. It wasn't off of like a real URL before that. It was off of some long AWS hosted resource URL thingy that no one would have ever remembered or be able to type in, but we had it sticky some places. But now you can just type heroscape.org and go to the builder tab and get there a lot easier. And then since then, we've been releasing Delta updates roughly every 4 months or so. Some of them are bigger than others. Hopefully we're trending towards a direction where stuff is more stable. That's certainly the ultimate goal. We'd like to make, ideally, feature updates start to become more small tweaks as opposed to massive jumps. I'm sure there's some units that we're still massively missed on, but hopefully if as long as stuff is trending towards a good stable state, I'm happy with that. And I do think that is the case, even though I'm sure we still have plenty of misses that we'll need to correct and get cleaned up in the future. And that's most of where we are today. For anyone out there, there is on the main Heroscape Discord, what is it called? Heroscapers Online, I think is the name of the biggest Discord for it. There is a channel on there for Delta, just for what that's worth. If you're curious, want to read through past conversations. Sometimes we get people who make suggestions on there, like, hey, maybe make this unit cheaper. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. So it's not an automatic include or anything like that. But it's sometimes we definitely have gotten ideas from there that or like, at least for me, I've seen some ideas from there that maybe I hadn't thought of before, and it triggered something. Doesn't always, but it can. So just one way to sort of engage with Delta is to hop in there. And then when new point totals get released, Doc makes a new post on the thread that's mentioned earlier, the thread on Heroscapers for like the modern Delta, and I update the point values in heroscape.org with whatever those new point totals are. There's actually a sort feature on the .org builder where you can sort by the Delta update date. So for instance, if you want to see all of the units that were changed with the last Delta update, you can do that sort, and it'll show you at the top the date that the update happened. It's something like a year or month, so it'll be listed as something like 2024-05.
What part of that would that be?
Good question. So if you're on the builder, so the sort, so the thing that defaults points low to high, when you're on the builder.
Yes.
If you scroll all the way to the bottom of that list, there's
Delta
an
update.
option called Delta Update.
That's nice.
And it wasn't applied yet. And so if you pull it up, you can see the units that were changed with that most recent update. Now, fair warning though, it's only accurate necessarily to the last update, because the .org builder doesn't save the entire history of Delta prices. It only saves the current value and the date that current value was set to. So for instance, I'm looking at it right now, it looks like we changed the Swag Rider point total to 15 for Delta Classic on 2024-05. Swag Rider might have been changed the update before that, it might not have, there's really no way to tell. That data is not tracked. All that we know is, that's the last change that was made to that unit.
The last update. Okay, that kind of makes sense. Yeah, no, I'm seeing it right now. And sorry for those of you who are listening to this on Spotify. You'll just have to go on heroscape.org to check this out yourself. But if you're watching this on YouTube, you're seeing exactly what I'm pointing to here. So very nice, very nice.
And if just in case anyone hasn't used it before, if you go to that Builder tab, there's a couple toggles at the top. One's for VC versus Classic, so it defaults to Classic. But if you want, Delta VC, you should toggle that to VC. And then the second toggle at the top is for Standard versus Delta pricing.
Right.
Again, defaults to Standard, but if you want Delta, toggle it to Delta, and then you'll see Delta prices instead. You want your Swag Rider to be 15 points instead of 25, give Delta a shot.
It's such a grand tool, and I do want to talk about it in a second. But one thing I wanted to ask you when it comes to Delta points, so managing the points, it's not like this is the points that we're deciding they're going to be Delta, and it stays that way. It's a fluid process then.
Yeah, I mean, every time we make an update, we're doing so because we think that new point total is better than the previous iteration. And there's a couple different ways that can look, though. One, in terms of an isolated unit, maybe an isolated unit gets dropped 10 points, like a solo hero. Say Sir Dupuy. I think we had dropped Dupuy a couple times because solo Dupuy's not good. Right, so there's a lot of standalone heroes like that where, maybe the update is just we made them cheaper, still nobody's playing it, let's drop them again. Some of the updates are a little more complex than that. When we're dealing with factions and potentially reassigning the point values within factions to try to make more sub builds of that faction viable. So for instance, one of the earlier updates that happened to the Knights and Heavy Gruts factions was we ended up the initial point costs had Gilbert and Chompy a little cheaper than they are now, with the with the squads maybe a little bit more expensive. And what we ended up later coming to the conclusion of is we can bump these two heroes that are godlike up a lot, make the squad a tad bit cheaper, and then maybe make some of the secondary bonding options a little bit cheaper as well. Stuff like Sir Denric or Tornak for the heavies, just to try to keep the core army of whatever the core was, something like Gilbert 4 Knights or Gilbert 3 Knights, right? Keep that roughly in the same ballpark, but decrease the point cost of say 4 Knights Denric a little bit, so that maybe that becomes slightly more viable. So some point costs, some updates are a little bit more, some parts of updates are a little more complex geared with faction realignments, where the goal is just to try to get more of the possible builds viable. It's not always possible to make every build viable. There's definitely some cases where I think it's just clearly impossible, and then we have to make sort of judgment calls about which army is the most interesting. I think that the most classic example of that for me is Cyprian and Sonia. So you can make a point cost that makes Cyprian the quote right price. You can have a point cost where Sonia is the right price. You can have a point cost where Cyprian and Sonia are the right price. But it doesn't really appear that you can have all three. That ends up being difficult just in terms of that triangle. So then it's okay, which two of these three armies are the most relevant and interesting for the meta? And the current decision for that one, and I think it's pretty reasonable, sorry Tony Stark, is that Cyprian and Cyprian plus Sonia are the two, more interesting versions of that build to have in the meta. And then so solo Sonia ends up just getting kind of nuked because we have to we make Cyprian a little cheaper so that solo Cyprian's viable, which forces us to push a little bit of point cost onto Sonia for the Cyprian plus Sonia build, but that then makes solo Sonia too expensive, and so she ends up basically not being playable. There aren't too many instances of that where stuff like that happens, but there definitely are some instances where it's just not possible to make everything good, and we have to make some judgment calls about which builds are the most interesting. Yeah, that kind of thing.
And so I imagine in the coming months and years, it might be a little bit busier for Delta Points when we start bringing in units from like Renegade, like VC. Are you considering doing like some type of point system for like NGC? Are you looking into that type of thing? What is there going to be more work in the future for you, do you think?
Yeah, I think there's a couple separate questions there that I'll try to
Sure.
unpack. In terms of NGC or any other like customs group that's not VC, the answer is really just no.
Okay.
I think that it really requires the people who are doing it to be subject matter experts in the like meta at those levels. And I can tell you, I'm not a subject matter expert there, right? Like, I would not be the right person to be trying to do that. I don't have the knowledge. I wouldn't be a good fit for that. In terms of, I actually like to back up. So in terms of the AOA stuff, I do want to point out like one more thing about like how Delta deals with new units, because we've actually already dealt with that for C3V units. A lot of C3V has gotten released since we started. The general idea is when the new unit gets released, it goes into Delta at its released point cost, period. We don't make assumptions. We're not trying to second guess. Whatever that release point cost is, it goes in at for the first update, which is going to be something like 4 months after that unit gets introduced. And then, beyond that, for the next update, then we look at potentially trying to update points. If we think that we have either a really good gut feeling or enough evidence that something needs to be adjusted. So in terms of the AOA stuff specifically, then, what that means is that the moment that all the cards for Wave 1 got released, they all went into Delta at the released point cost. Iwashia's printed cost is 115 points. Iwashia has been in Delta at 115 points since then. Specifically for AOA, I suspect that we'll see a lot of point costs for the Wave 1 Delta stuff changing at the next release, which is, we actually started publishing a theoretical release date. It's sometime in late August. I believe that date is on the Delta thread, doc thread on Heroscapers, but I don't know the exact date off the top of my head. But I would expect that a lot of the AOA stuff starts to get point values adjusted there. We've had a few tournaments, OHS tournaments, to get data from. I imagine most of us have gotten some data from locals, and then probably more importantly, we will have an entire ScapeCon 4 worth of data on how those AOA units play, for that point in time. And that should give us a lot more evidence to try and make some more judgment calls. And I think that in general, probably the biggest point jump that things are going to have is that first update after they were introduced. So they get introduced at standard point cost, and then 4 months later, when that next update comes out, that's probably going to be the biggest jump for most things. Not always, but it's a reasonable guesstimate. And then probably continue to tweak from there as people try out different builds and different combinations. I'm sure that plenty of the AOA stuff hasn't been used in a lot of armies where it might be good that I didn't, that I haven't thought of yet, for example. And so, we'll get more data as time goes on. Someone comes up with a cool way to break Delta. I know I've done my fair share of trying to break some Delta units, so it's always a fun time there. Microcore are a little more expensive now than they used to be. I'm quite happy about that, the work that led to that one. But definitely.
Challenge, everybody. This is the challenge.
Now, there's one other interesting question. I don't think it was directly asked in there, but I think it's worth mentioning just because I don't have the answer for it yet. So, but it's worth throwing the question out there, which is how does that interact with the new 10 units that Renegade changed the point cost for? I have no idea. And you know what, frankly, I don't know what's going on there. I don't know if Renegade's gonna change the point values of more things in the future or not. For now, those point values aren't, affecting Delta, but that's really all I got there. All I can say on that one is I know it's an open question and I don't have any real information to pass on. I'm in the so just for what that's worth.
For sure. Joe, do you have any thoughts, any questions for him?
It's funny because Chris, you answered one of them already for me, was talking about how you get your data. I follow a lot of video games and they talk about patch notes. They come out patch notes every 3 months for certain games. They get all their data right from the games themselves. Tons and tons of stuff. But like you said, like you get it from the online Heroscape. You get your now you get a lot of data from .org. So every time someone plugs in a win or a loss, you could see what army that they're playing. And then of course your personal experience between you, Doc, and Veggie. So
yeah, some theory crafting that goes into that as well. Just like making educated guesses based on experience for armies, for stuff that I haven't necessarily played. I'm sure the same is true with Doc and Veggie. Like I've voted on plenty of updates for builds that I haven't actually played on a physical table in a while with that. But yeah, I mean, the data is definitely a big part of that. I think that for us, at least I shouldn't say for us. I think that for me, probably the biggest two sources of data that I'm willing to rely more heavily on is OHS results and ScapeCon results. Mostly because I'm fairly confident with sort of like where the competitive scene with those two things is at, and feel that it's at a very high level. And so when like an army does really well at, say, like an open event at ScapeCon or an OHS season, where like people that I know to be very good players weren't able to beat it with other stuff, like that's a pretty strong data point for me. It's a little bit stronger of a data point than like looking through some locals on .org, including our own my own locals, although where like if I don't know, there's just so many factors that go into it, like skill levels of the players, timing of games, that like some of those factors are just controlled for better from my perspective in OHS and ScapeCon. So it's not that I certainly will look at all that rest of that data, but I'd say that those two are probably the biggest data points that I think are the most useful for making changes.
Does the format of an event change any perspective on how a Delta figure unit is valued?
Absolutely. I think the biggest example that we've had a lot of is like rule of X, right? Like rule of 12. So some stuff gets either like way better or way worse at rule of 12, right? Venic Vipers are pretty trash in rule of 12, just like across the board. Like 4 Venic Vipers is not good, right? You need more than 4 of them. So like Venics aren't good in rule of 12 Delta currently. That's not something that I necessarily want to change, right? Like our general guidelines for like what we're aiming for is something in the 400 to 600 point range. That's usually like the definition of like a standard point range for tournaments. So we're aiming for something to be reasonably balanced within that 200 point sort of gap there, and then we're be reasonable for like normal figure limits, something like 18 to 24 figure limits, something on the higher end, and then just like a breadth of formats, but not all, right? And so some stuff, a lot of times what'll happen, at least for me, is just the questions like, what formats is this unit best in? Because like what I don't want to have is a unit be like so broken in a super common format that it becomes an issue. Like that would be a problem. On the flip side, sometimes units are not as good at certain formats, and there's really nothing that can be done about that. Different units are also point costs. Let me back that up. So a few units are point costed for like specific maps or specific things where they're just really good. Because if we don't do that, they end up being like quite strong on those specific subset of stuff. So like some terrain units get that effect. Not all. Obsidian guards are kind of trash even on lava maps, so they don't get a huge boost for that. But there's definitely a few units out there where we have to sort of price them for like a specific map pool idea or a specific format, just because they are so good in that one thing. We don't. But for the most part, trying to get across the board spectrum of a decent bring one being the most obvious format, bring one no restriction being the most obvious, and then just like whatever the most common formats are above that. It's always kind of a tricky one to balance, because those tend to go in vogue, in and out a little bit. Like, you'll see a lot of Rule of 12 formats, and recently, I don't know if we'll continue to see lots of Rule of 12 over the next 2 years or not. Maybe we will, maybe we won't. So it's a little bit of a gamble, I would say, to try to update points for something specific like that, necessarily. But yeah, you definitely see some stuff shine at certain formats and some stuff be really terrible. Another example of that is like, I think there are several formats where Master of the Hunt is very, very good in Delta. Like Monster Mash, or like any kind of format where you're incentivizing to have a lot of heroes, where the meta is things where his special power is quite good. The flip side of that is like, at standard, if it's just like bring a bunch of squads, even at 100 points, he's not the best unit in the world. Like if you're going to face like Stingers X6 or something, killing one Stinger a turn isn't very good. So, so there's some units like that where like they're either really good or really bad, depending on the format, where it's tough to, I don't know. It can be tough to sort of have a point total that works across a bunch. And those types of things are definitely hard questions to try to balance and whatnot. And, not claiming that we've done a perfect job of balancing any of that stuff, but those are the questions and the factors that go into, at least from my perspective, when I'm thinking about point totals and point adjustments. Another one is just like total usage. So like one of the things we noticed from .org, I'm able to see how many times a unit has been included in an army over a given time gap. So like a start date to an end date, just like physically how many times. And two units that were being included an absolute ton in Delta events were Miburxa and Krav, even at their higher point cost. So at the time, like Miburxa at 70 was still just being included in a ton of armies. A little bit of that was sample size bias, I think, because there were so many Rule of 12 events where Romans Miburxa was just really good at those Rule of 12 events. But it was still just like such an absurd number of Miburxa includes that we pushed Miburxa by 5 points up to 75 a couple updates ago. Same thing for Krav. I think the Krav were 115 for a while, and then we bumped them up to 120. They were just being included so much. And it was just like, +5 is probably not a bad idea, given how many people clearly think that they're still very good. They're probably still slightly above spectrum. I don't know. And then the flip side of all that is there's some units that just like super healthy for a meta and just get a variance tax added onto them. You can imagine like Deadeye Dan or Azazel. For C3V Azazel come to mind for that, where it's just like, if we accidentally make these things viable, the strategy of running them is just kind of silly and not particularly fun for everyone involved. Like if Azazel ends up being good in some form, and then you're just running Azazel Rats X5, like I don't think a whole lot of people want to play that game. I would guess most people don't. So there's some stuff like that where some units are just like still kind of trash. There's also a kind of a small category of units where I'm not convinced that they're salvageable in Delta, because Roman archers come to mind as an example of this, where it's like, if we made Roman archers cheap enough to where they actually were like correct for their stat line, in my perspective, they become too cheap of fodder units for stuff like Wanic or like a rat screen. Like if we made Roman archers like 20 points, which like, I don't know, maybe that's the right number for their actual stats because they're just trash, right? But then you can start to do dumb things like Roman Archers X7 Q9 Raylan at some point totals, right? Where then like you just got, your normal defense is terrible, but now you've got 21 bodies of 3 defense sitting in front of Q9, which, that's still pretty good in terms of what it can do to some stuff. So there's some like weird side effects where some units just might not be salvageable. Those are like sort of small groups. I would say that like across the general spectrum, I think probably about 80% of stuff is viable in most stuff. Maybe 80 to 85%, and then there's just a smattering of stuff that is just kind of unsalvageable for various reasons. At least in some formats, if not across the board. But we try to keep as many things out of that bin as possible.
Sure. Yeah, still good. Yeah.
My God, Chris, I know you're really knowledgeable about Heroscape, but my God, I didn't realize the amount of depth.
Oh, yeah.
Like this is like Warhammer lore depth of knowledge and experience. My God.
Oh, Joe, he is
that was so fascinating.
He is so out of our league that it's just like we might as well just hang up our headphones and just walk away and just let him take control. It's just
absolutely. And
I would be streaming. You would be just like listening to static for the next.
Oh my God. Yeah, that is incredible. It is truly incredible how much work that the three of you guys are putting into this. And obviously you guys are getting tons and tons of feedback from the community, using the Discord, which is phenomenal. I had no idea there was a Delta tab. I assumed there probably was, but I didn't realize where it was. So that's also really good to go check that out. But I talk to a lot of people in the community, and anytime I ask them about Delta, it's usually, oh my God, I love it. Let's use Delta. Please, let's use Delta. Do you ever feel like Delta should just be the new classic? Should that just override, at least for the community aspect of it all?
I don't. I love classic points too. I think both are awesome and have lots of formats where they're super cool and fun. There's some formats that I love dearly where I think Delta points don't make a lot of sense. Reverse the Whip comes to mind, frankly. I mean, you could run Reverse the Whip Delta. I'm not convinced that it's a great idea. I certainly wouldn't want it to be done at something like ScapeCon, where you've got such an established meta for the, for the Reverse the Whip format that's there, where like if you made some kind of drastic alteration like that, no one would know what meta would look like next year or have anything to base it off of. So like that's an example where I think that probably would be a bad idea. For another example, we have a local coming up for New Hampshire. I live in New Hampshire. We've got a local coming up next where someone suggested the format was a Monster Mash 600 points with max 200 small medium, right? And then I was asked, do I think that this should be standard or Delta pricing? And for that format, I thought standard was a better option than Delta for a couple reasons. One, that we weren't going to have any cap. It was like a 24-figure cap, no hex cap. So spamming Templar becomes pretty good in Delta, like unreasonable borderline in that one, right? Like Templar got to drop so much to make him solid at other point totals, but like when you can just spam 7 Templar at 600, that's pretty damn good army and not necessarily great. For that particular one, it's our first VC event, and I really wanted Heracles to be viable in the format because it's real cool VC for that specific format. And so if we take that point total and do Delta, I mean, this is one's really specific to that exact trip. But like if we take that exact point total and do Delta, he goes from 200 to 220 and he doesn't fit anymore. But no, I wouldn't want to replace anything. I think that both are awesome and that different formats. I think that saying here's a format. Should this format be Delta or standard pricing to make the most interesting and most fun meta possible is a great spot to be at, to have both available as tools for tournament organizers to utilize. So yeah, I love having both.
Interesting. Nice. Yeah, I mean, format comes into a lot of this. It's quite insane to think about, to know that what format you're playing, and what the meta is will determine if what you want to see comes or not. Based on the points. It's incredible. It's so interesting.
Yeah, and it's easy to it's easy to accidentally make a bad one, where something dumb like Templar X7 spam is just like awesome accidentally. Yeah, and it's just more tools means more ability to make formats with good healthy metas, and I think that's a great thing. But yeah, formats have a ton of impact. And anytime that you get like the further away you get from like a standard 400 to 600 point, the higher chance that doing Delta is going to create something wonky and unexpected. So if you're going to run something that's like more way out of the norm, I wouldn't say don't use Delta. I would say be a little more cautious to think through what units in Delta might or might not have an outsized effect on that specific format. Just double check it. Go through some of the stuff that's been changed a lot and be like, is this a good idea or a bad idea? And depending on the format, it could be either, right? Just know that like the further away you go from sort of that standard bring 400 to 600, the more likely it is that something weird is going to happen in your meta with using Delta points, just because it's not that's not the primary target.
And I think it's something that Heroscaper's mentioned in the chat, and I'm thinking of this too. So you think like Delta's built a little bit more for competitive play, as opposed to just like casual play is more of like it's up in the air, but probably more classic points of commission
for competitive play. I would say, however, that the pricing is meant to reflect what we feel top competitive players could do with those units. So like, if I wanted to run a game in my house with friends who don't play a ton and they wanted to run Einar Imperium, I'd probably say let's use Delta, because they're going to have a much more fun time running Einar Imperium at Delta than they are at Standard. That being said, there's like some of those units that have like a higher skill gap, or like where like, you know, stuff like rats, like you mentioned earlier, right? Like anything that we kind of have to price those units for what a top competitive player can do with them, because otherwise they end up just getting absolutely abused at the top competitive levels of, you know, like Delta tournaments that would exist. So yeah, I wouldn't say it's not like intrinsically geared for it, but we do have to take into account like what is the best, you know, like what is the best use of this unit, and what can, you know, in terms of like trying to actually put those prices up. But I mean, absolutely use it for whatever you want, you know.
For sure.
Especially if you want to, you know, just playing for fun, and you have units that are traditionally in the like B- and under tier, you know, Delta's probably going to give you a more fun matchup, or a more even matchup between you and your friend that you're playing with. Not always, but, you know, more often than not, I would say.
All right, Joe, I don't know if you have anything else, but I do have one more thing just to wrap this up, and it's not more of a question, more of a statement. Anybody listening, everybody watching, actually two things. Number one, Renegade, if anybody from Renegade is listening right now, and I keep on saying this, like anytime we talk about something innovative from the Heroscape community, study this stuff, check it out. It will only make the way you manage Heroscape in the game that much better. Trying to do it by yourself, it's just probably going to gum things up. Why try and reinvent the wheel when it's already made? You can add some stickers on it, you know, kind of make it a little bit flashier, but that wheel is already made, you know. Take note of that and learn from it. So that's point number one. Now, point number two is, Chris, go back to you. For anybody like watching, listening, check out Heroscape.org. It is the site to go to when it comes to not just competitive play, because I mean you got the thing that looks up maps now. If you want to do casual play, you can build your armies just like that. And when it comes to tournament play, and this is something I only found out a few weeks ago, and here I'm just gonna pull this up, because I don't know, Chris, how long ago this was created, but I just only discovered a few weeks ago. Like, say if I go to conventions, I go to Escape Con 4, and let me just hit let's just three-headed Hydra here, and I go, there is an option for Army Builder, and then the Army Builder, instead of going just to the main Army Builder, you go to the Army Builder within that tournament, and it already has the specifications selected out to where it will guide you through building your army even more. It won't, and
it will prevent you from going over the max. At least the
exactly.
Point, not all the maxes, but the right. Point max.
Exactly. It will only allow you to add like I mean, this is 460 points Delta, but say for building an army where you're only limited a amount of like squads or miniatures, it won't let you go over, you know, and it'll show in the red on times when you're over something. That is so invaluable and so way ahead of anything that Renegade has shown us so far on their website. So I don't know how long ago you created that.
Tournament Builder page as a whole has been there for a while, but a few of the features that you mentioned are very new.
Okay, they are.
Specifically like the Rule of 9, Rule of 12 thing. Mm-hmm. That was a very recent addition.
Okay.
In terms of like not letting you put more than that number of units that are actually in there. Mm-hmm. You can also get to that, for what it's worth, if you just go to the normal builder. Mm-hmm. There's a link at the top of that above the toggles where it says Tournament Builder. Yeah. And then that'll take you to the same page with the drop down not pre-filled, and then you can see it shows all the upcoming tournaments.
Okay. Oh, Tournament Builder right there. Okay.
Yeah. And then it just shows all the upcoming tournaments in order of start time. So right now it's totally populated with all the ScapeCon stuff because ScapeCon's coming up.
You got Wisconsin.
But there's other stuff down there, and you can see all the upcoming tournaments there, and you click on one, and it'll load the settings into that for whatever that tournament is.
Wow. Now I'm even more impressed.
So yeah, but those are in there, and there's a lot of recent. I made a change recently with a lot of stuff with like that it supports like some additional restrictions like Rule of 12 and things like that. off the top of my head. If that's not the only one, but I think that's the one that had been most requested, where people wanted like rule of 12 to not let you select a fourth squad of Romans, because a few people had done that on accident, and then like they had a less than fun tournament because they didn't have other figures and they couldn't play their 5 Romans. So so that is in there now. If you're setting up a tournament, like if you're creating a tournament from scratch, there's a bunch of options at the bottom of the page when you're doing that, including things like rule of X. And you can fill out any sort of combination of those options, and most of them have an effect on the builder. Not 100%, but most. There's a couple that are just too complex that I'm not able to program at this point in time in there.
Gotcha.
The two most common examples that I think, for just like a heads up for anyone using it, General Wars has no effect on the builder. That's primarily because there's just so many permutations of it. I haven't not thought of a good way to do it.
Okay.
Right? Like there's General Wars where everything's from one general. There's General Wars where everything is from 2 generals in like pre-paired groups. There's General Wars where you can pick one general up to 370 points and another general up to 150 points. And there's just so many permutations of it. I haven't been able to come up with a way to put that in there. So that one, like you can tag it with that, and it'll show that as a tag on the format so people understand like roughly what it is, but it's not going to affect the builder. The other one is the, what is it named? Sorry, I'm looking at it. I'm trying to find it. It's an alphabetical, which isn't the way I think about it, but is probably helpful for more people. Sorry, trying to find this.
Oh, okay.
It's not ban list. It's the one that's similar to ban list. Restricted list. Yeah. So the idea of the restricted list format is like there's a list of like say 10 or 20 cards where you can't have more than one of them in your army. So like you can have Raylan, Q9, or Rats, but not 2 of those 3 things. And that doesn't have an effect on the builder either. That one is not programmed in to do anything at the moment.
Right, yeah, and I noticed that in like the 40-plus-year-old tournament builder for that one for ScapeCon. The like whoever's 40 and older, because I'm 41, so I can get in that this year. So yeah, I noticed that I still have to like I got to pay attention to what I can include or exclude in that. So, but no,
so there's a couple like that where they're not actually in the builder just for complexity reasons, where either I haven't had the time to do it, or it's just like in the case of General Wars, I don't think it's there's just too many too many variations. But pretty much all the other, I'm not 100% sure. No, Assassination also might not have an effect. So there's a couple of them where they don't have an effect for like Assassin's Creed has so many different variations of it. It's like I don't know what point total or how many. There's just too many. It would require too much input from the users creating it plus a complicated system to do much. But most of the others do have an effect. You toggle heroes only. The squads are all gone from that builder when that tournament gets put up. Stuff like that.
It's a very nice guide. It's a very, very nice.
Another cool recent one is the X plus minus and under. So like if you're running an event and you want to say in standard pricing, you want to do B plus and under, where it just removes all the B plus, all the A minus units or whatever. If you select that and type in B minus, the builder is automatically going to filter out everything that's above that. What in standard points that uses, so not in standard points, in classic Heroscape that uses OEAO's power rankings, and in VC it uses DOC's power rankings, which are those are the 2 that are used on the site for depending on which one you're actually looking at. Because you can also sort by those normally in the builder, just as like a sort option. But yeah, those are the 2 rankings that it uses depending on whether it's VC or not. Yeah, lots of little tags down there that you can use to, filter the form, make your tournament builder do the various combinations of whatever it is that you're setting up. Yeah.
All right. Well, so that is taking a look at in kind of a very big nutshell, but in a nutshell, taking a look at Delta Points, checking out Heroscape.org a little bit from the man himself who created Heroscape.org, and who's helped designing the Delta Points, Chris Perkins. And we thank him so much for joining us for this podcast and this segment.